Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to everyone watching and listening online, to everyone gathered here in this place. We're continuing our journey through the Gospel of John. And in John chapters 20 and 21, the resurrected Jesus makes 4 appearances. One to Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb on the first day of the week, and then 3 appearances to his gathered disciples. And 2 of those are in Jerusalem. And then the final appearance is in Galilee, and it's in chapter 21. And it functions as a kind of epilogue to the entire gospel. It's a delightful and insightful story, chock full of the detail and the symbolism that we've come to expect from John. It also packs an emotional punch. At least it does for those of us who need to hear it today. So let's begin reading in chapter 21, verse 1. This is afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee or Tiberias, depending on your translation. It's the same body of water. This is the second story John tells in his gospel that is set on or near the Sea of Galilee. The first one was back in chapter 6, when Jesus fed a multitude of people with a few fish and some bread. I wonder what will happen this time. Well, if we keep reading, John says it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. So if you're counting, that's 7 of the 11 disciples of Jesus who were together in this place. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, well, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. In the wake of Jesus' resurrection, Peter, unsure of himself, returns to what he knows and does best. He's a professional fisherman. Let's get back to what I know. And yet they fish all night and don't catch a thing. Early then in the morning, verse 4, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. Those who know Jesus best continue to have difficulty recognizing the resurrected Jesus. And that raises all sorts of interesting and puzzling questions for which I do not have the answers. It's just the resurrected Jesus was not always that obvious. And so in verse 5, Jesus called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Once again, it takes a second word or a second action from Jesus to make himself recognizable to his disciples. Well, as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It's the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water, Forrest Gump style, like when Forrest saw Lieutenant Dan. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals, a charcoal fire, there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish. Maybe this is a fish story. Large fish, 153 to be precise. But even with so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come, have breakfast." When Peter and the disciples reach the shore, they see that the risen Jesus is already cooking. He says, "Come and eat." which is very similar to what he said at the beginning of the gospel, remember, when he said, come and see. Now it's come and eat. Come and have some breakfast with me. The Good Shepherd has appeared to feed his sheep. But he's there to do more than just feed them some fish. He's also going to clarify and fortify their mission. He invites them to bring some of the fish they caught, with his help, some of their fish to the feast. And so Peter walks back to the boat, and John says he drags or hauls the net full of fish to Jesus. And John is very specific. It's 153 of those big suckers. And the net never tore. This is an amazing, call it a miraculous catch of fish. And is so often the case in the Gospel of John, though, there's more beneath the surface. There's a deeper meaning here. The word John uses in the original language for drag or to haul, they couldn't haul it into the boat. Peter hauls the net to Jesus, can also be translated as draw. That's a word Jesus uses 2 times earlier in the gospel. The first time back in chapter 6, verse 44, when Jesus said, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws or hauls or drags them. And I will raise them at the last day." And then again in chapter 12, verse 32, Jesus says, "And I, when I'm lifted up from the earth," talking about the cross, resurrection, and ascension, "will draw or haul or even maybe drag all people to myself." This detail makes the connection and unlocks that deeper meaning beneath this amazing story. What's really going on here? By themselves, they catch nothing. On their own, apart from Jesus, they are unsuccessful. But then as soon as Jesus shows up, tells them what to do, and they start following his instructions, they catch an abundance of fish, which then Peter draws or hauls or drags to Jesus. This is not just some fish story. It is an enacted parable in which Jesus is revealing how he's going to accomplish his mission on earth. He's going to do it through the disciples. He's going to draw all kinds of people, a net full of people to himself through the testimony and the ministry, the preaching and teaching of his disciples. He will accomplish his mission through them. This is John's version of what Jesus says in Luke chapter 5 when he calls the disciples away from their nets and their boats and says, "From now on, you will fish for people." This is about the disciples' larger global mission. From here, the story moves from the global, the universal, the deeply symbolic, to the deeply personal. It's not an accident that John includes the detail about the charcoal fire on the beach. He's mentioned a charcoal fire once before in the story. It was back in chapter 18. There was a charcoal fire burning in the courtyard of the high priest, where Peter was standing there warming himself when he denied the Lord 3 times. I'm sure that unmistakable, irrepressible smell of a charcoal fire, and you know that smell, don't you? You never forget it. And you can catch a whiff of one now and it'll take you back to that camping trip or what you used to do with your scout troop years ago. I'm sure the smell of that fire in Peter's nostrils reminded him of that embarrassing, shameful failure when he denied Jesus. Sitting there by that fire, eating fish and bread, Jesus and Peter still have some unfinished business. Maybe that's why he jumped into the water and swam to shore. He couldn't wait to get there. And so after the meal, Jesus invites Peter to take a walk on the beach. We know they're walking because of something that happens later on in the story. As they're walking along, though, Jesus asks Peter 3 questions, or actually, he asks Peter the same question 3 times. He says in verse 15, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, there's a huge mystery in this verse. What Jesus means by these is not entirely clear. It could be that by these, Jesus means the other disciples. And so, Simon, do you love me more than the other disciples love me? Do you still love me the most? Now, that may seem like an odd question, but remember, Peter loved to boast about his superior faithfulness to Jesus. Back in chapter 13, before he denied him, Peter declared, he vowed, "I will lay down my life for you." The assumption being, they may not be willing to die for you, Jesus, but I'm willing to die with and for you. And so Jesus says, do you really love me more than these? Or maybe these refer to the fish Peter just caught, the net, the boat, his fishing equipment. Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me more than your old way of life as a fisherman, which Peter instinctively returned to after the resurrection? Whichever one it is, and believe me, it is up for grabs. No one knows for sure. The point of the question seems to be to give Peter the chance to give a better answer than the last time he was asked about his relationship with Jesus when he was standing near a charcoal fire. And Peter doesn't need any extra time to think about his answer. Immediately he says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Probably thinking to himself, "Remember, I jumped in the water to get to you?" And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Okay. And then immediately in verse 16, Jesus asks the question again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And again, Peter answers, "Of course you know I love you." And Jesus says, "Okay, good, take care of my sheep." Okay. And then Jesus asks the question a 3rd time. "Do you love me?" And this 3rd question hurts Peter. Cuts him to the very soul. 3 questions, 1 for each denial. And again, Peter insists, "You know I love you." And again, Peter says, "Feed my sheep." We might be expecting Jesus to speak words of comfort and encouragement and forgiveness to Peter, but instead he gives him a job to do. He wants Peter to become a shepherd of God's flock. Jesus is still the good shepherd who lays down and takes his life up again for the sake of his flock. Jesus is still the chief shepherd who will feed his sheep, but now he's going to do it through Peter and the other disciples. Once again, Jesus is going to accomplish his mission, whether it's fishing for people or feeding his sheep, through the ministry of the disciples, and that includes Peter. Impulsive, inconsistent Peter, who denied him 3 times. I used to think that Jesus made Peter answer the question 3 times as a way of raking him over the coals, pun intended. But now I see it just the opposite. Jesus isn't punishing Peter with these questions. He's putting him back together. Sometimes the only way a wound can be healed is it first must be exposed, and the exposure of a tender wound can be painful, but it's for benefit, not for punishment. Jesus isn't forcing Peter to relive those denials. He's inviting him to relinquish them. He continues to work on Peter's heart because Jesus still has work for Peter to do. And so just as Jesus did with Mary in her grief, and Thomas in his doubt, He does for the wounded Peter. He begins to heal his heart with a personalized encounter that gives Peter exactly what he needs in that moment. Many of you know that years ago, my family and I moved from Tulsa to Austin to start a new church there. We were church planters. And it did not go well, and it did not work out. I took it really hard. Afterward, I was overwhelmed with a sense of embarrassment and shame. The story I kept telling myself was not, hey, I failed while trying to do a really, really difficult thing that a lot of people also fail at doing. That's not the story I was telling myself. My story was, I am, all the way to the core of my being, a failure. And at the time, I wasn't sure that I would ever preach or work with a church again. Actually, I was pretty sure I wouldn't. And one of the hardest things for me as a failed church planter back then was going back to church. And one Sunday, I was dreading in particular and nervous about visiting a church across town in Austin where I was sure I would see people that I knew and people who knew me well enough to begin asking awkward questions about the failed church plant. And I didn't want to go, and I didn't want to be there, and I didn't want to have those conversations. So we intentionally showed up late, which is a great strategy. Intentionally showed up late to avoid those awkward conversations. We sat on the back row, and we slipped out during the final song. Heather went to the back to pick up the boys from children's church, and I headed to the exit, my head down. And on my way out, thinking, I'm about to make it. I'm almost out of here. On my way out, I heard someone shout, "Hey, Wade!" And I look up, and I saw Sydney, a 13-year-old family friend with Down syndrome. Sydney was, and I'm sure still is, a hugger. Her hugs are big and strong and last a second too long. No, I'm not a hugger, so every hug lasts a second too long for me. Sydney waved, and then she sprinted across the church lobby and gave me one of her specialty hugs. But this wasn't just a typical greeting from Sydney, not for me. Because as I saw her running toward me, I saw the Lord, or heard the Lord, telling me through her, this is how I feel about you. And I'm so glad you're here. And then God used Sydney to squeeze the anxiety and the embarrassment and the shame out of me. Like Mary and Thomas and Peter, the risen Lord gave me exactly what I needed that day. Not only did I start to feel better about myself, it took some time, but I started to feel better. I also was not as uncomfortable in church, which was a good thing because as it turned out, the Lord still had some preaching for me to do. Now looking back on it, I see that encounter with Sydney as my walk on the beach with the risen Lord. If you are embarrassed, overwhelmed with a sense of failure, if you're not sure that you're still considered by the Good Shepherd to be one of his sheep after your latest oh no, boo-boo bonanza, if you don't think God can use you anymore, or maybe if you simply don't know what to do next. You're stuck or you're lost, and you don't know where to go or what to do. I hope that you would hear in this story in chapter 21 an invitation from the risen Lord to come and eat. He always has room at his table, always room around his fire. But then don't be surprised if after the meal he invites you to go for a walk on the beach. And as you're walking, he may ask you some questions, and some of those questions may be uncomfortable, not because he intends you harm, but because he wants to heal you. He may ask you some questions, he may give you some instructions, he may give you a hug. He may do all three. Whatever it is, you can rest assured that he will do exactly what is needed to heal your heart and lift your head and get you back on mission. No matter what you have done to disappoint or deny the Lord or make you feel like a useless failure, the risen Jesus is not done with you. Don't give up on following him, because I promise he's not giving up on you. He will continue to work on your heart because he still has work for you to do. It's not over. It's never over as long as the crucified Jesus is alive. Peter's work as a fisher of people and a shepherd of God's flock ultimately led him to make good on his vow to lay down his life for Jesus, and not just Jesus, but also for Jesus' sheep. In chapter 21, verse 18 and 19, Jesus tells Peter what's coming. He says, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Church tradition tells us that Peter was crucified in Rome in the mid-60s during Nero's persecution of the Christians. Peter reportedly asked to be crucified upside down because he did not feel he was worthy to die in the manner of his Lord. Peter's walk on the beach with Jesus helped empower him to follow Jesus all the way to the cross. Literally, all the way to the cross. And there he followed in his Lord's footsteps and glorified God, not just with his life, but with his death. May your walk on the beach with Jesus give you the purpose and the passion and the power to follow our risen Lord wherever he leads. And may our risen Lord lead all of us to glory. Let's stand and sing.